Investments in India. For the same, may I call upon the Chair, Mr. Rakesh Sood, former Ambassador. The Moderator of the session, Dr. Chaitanya Giri, Associate Professor, Flame University. And Panelist, Captain Vishal Kanwar, MD PwC, Mr. Bhaskar Puri, AVP Aerospace and Defence Space in West India, Mr. Pranav Satyanath, Independent Researcher and Policy Analyst. This session is designed to unravel the complexities and opportunities in the space commerce, providing critical insights into India's strategic roadmap for its space aspirations. Over to you, Chair.
Hello and good morning to everybody. If we can all settle down, we can start the session. Can I request somebody to please shut the door? Let me welcome you to the first session that we have after the inaugural, and this is a session that is supposed to set the ground in terms of space policy. This is, none of you who's sitting here are strangers to the Indian space policy that was issued last year, or for the norms and guidelines that came out in May this year. So the question that what I would think that we could perhaps focus on in this during the short presentations that are going to be made by the panelists and then the Q&A is to explore whether the norms and guidelines that have been put out, how far do they go in terms of implementing the policy? Do they fall short? Do they not fall short? The policy is certainly a very expansive policy, but the policy has been a long time in coming. If you remember, the policy was preceded by a draft bill in Parliament, which then lapsed. And so, in a sense, a policy can't be a substitute for an act. But nonetheless, there has to be a beginning somewhere. So that is what we would look at. The other thing I would mention is that I have always felt that while in space is a great idea, but can in space deliver the role that it is expected to under the policy? Can it deliver on that role in its current shape, or does it need some more backing? And the reason I ask is because there is the organizational structure. If you look at the organizational chart of InSpace, you realize that while it is supposedly autonomous under the Department of Space, there are certain linkages which can very easily raise questions as to whether it can actually provide a level playing field between government agencies as well as non-governmental entities, which is what it is supposed to do. At the same time, there is a certain buzz in the air in terms of the startup industry in space, which has expanded considerably. And this is something that is being seen the world over. It's not just in India. We are seeing this in other countries as well, which have space programs where countries are, where new space startups are entering the field and giving a run for the money to whether government agencies, whether it is NASA or whether it is ISRO. The other thing that has happened is the changing nature of warfare. And I think nowhere is this more evident than in Ukraine, where if you recall, just before the Ukraine war, months before the Ukraine war, there was intelligence reports coming in And a lot of that had to do with space. And it had been concluded that before the actual fighting begins, before the Russians move into Ukraine, it will be preceded by a cyber attack on communications. And so the moment the Viasat thing went down, it was quite clear. And so the Americans had actually put into place fail-safe communication links for Zelensky and his team in order to keep in contact with Washington when the conflict began. Later on, of course, as everybody knows, Starlink came into the picture in a big way. But the moment the Viasat link went down, it has been documented in some new books as well, that the moment the Viasat link went down, it was quite clear that now it was just a question of hours and that this was going to take place. And that's exactly what happened. So the idea that you have defense and various aspects of defense, from intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, monitoring, etc., all of this has an enormous bearing. And we see that in India. We see it in the IDEX. The Ministry of Defense has a defense space agency. It has had it for some time. We see it in the IDEX, where the private sector startups are being encouraged. Some of the challenges that have been put out under IDEX scheme relate to space. We also see this in the Ind-USX, something that we have started bilaterally between India and the United States under the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies. All of this indicates that there is a ferment about space, both in terms of civilian applications, civilian involvement, funding, and so on, as well as on the part of the government. Now, clearly, all of this cannot be done just by the government, cannot be done just by ISRO, because after all, the ISRO budget, even if it has been growing, but even today, it stands at something like $1.7, $1.8 billion. And that's not enough for the kind of demands that are being made on it. And this is what leads us to the back again to the space policy and how it can bring about the kind of transformation that is needed in terms of bringing it to take off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sood. It's lovely to be again here at the India Space Congress. I'm the moderator for this session, and this is the third iteration. This is the third India Space Congress that we are hosting, and time really flies. I still remember the day when we inaugurated India Space Congress 2022. Fantastic turnout, fantastic audience. And the excitement for the sector continues even to this day. A lot has happened since then. A lot of water has flown under the bridge. And today we are here discussing the ISC, the India Space Policy 2023. We'll discuss the National Geospace Policy, which came out 2 years ago. And when we started India Space Congress, these policies were yet decent. We were speaking about them. And here we are. Both these policy documents are now part of history. We are speaking as if they've been formulated, they've come out a long time ago. And what keeps us going, what keeps us all going is what next. So in this session, my learned panelists will be speaking more about what next. There's a lot to do. Times are getting exciting. India is getting into a really exciting phase of tech development on geoeconomic front, as Sir said, on the geopolitical front. The challenges are also mounting, not only for us, for the entire global economy. And how do we meander through these labyrinthous developments? We are here to discuss that in this first session. And I'll open up with Bhaskar Puri, who leads the aerospace defense arm of Invest India. And Bhaskar will be speaking on, I'll let him speak.
Thank you, Professor Giri, for the opportunity. So coming to the topic of this discussion here. So I would just qualify my statements first by saying that the statements that I'm going to make, or the things that I'm going to talk about, are my personal opinions of having seen the sector, worked with it, and looking to attract investments also in this sector as part of my role at Invest India. But those should not be construed as statements or the thought process of the government as such. Since I represent a government agency, those should not be taken as the thought process of the government in this case. Those are my personal opinions. Okay, so the first thing I would like to say, when we are looking at India's space aspirations, the space market that we have, and we are looking to grow it further, diversify it. If we go by some first principles thinking, the most fundamental aspect of any market is demand. Everything else, the policy, the regulations, ease of doing business, whatever, those are secondary aspects which ultimately decide how the market grows and expands and evolves. But demand is always the fundamental thing. If you are looking and focusing only on the other aspects, then you are missing the forest for the trees. When it comes to demand, now given that space as a geography is highly strategic in nature, there will always be heavy government regulation and involvement as well, both in terms of enabling as well as in terms of consuming the activities and all the efforts that go into that sector. Government will always be a big customer as well in terms of demand. Now, given that the current space boom that we are seeing is more of, it is, of course, there are the end products that are coming out for the space sector, where all the satellite data products, all the communications, the data, the Earth observation, everything that's happening. But there's a lot of boom also in terms of deployment of satellites, ground stations, constellations, launch vehicles. Now, to use an analogy, now this is an infrastructure building phase that is happening here. It is similar to, say, in a new geography, if you are laying down new railroads or oil pipelines or power lines. That's the infrastructure building part. You can look at what is happening in the space sector from that perspective. But once the infrastructure is developed, so there is a one-time shot where the infrastructure is built and some people make a lot of money building that. Once the infrastructure is developed, the business as usual state is what flows through the infrastructure and the maintenance of it. Now we have a window of, say, around 10 years or so for India to actually catch up with the others also in building the infrastructure. So we will have to step up the companies and the organizations in the space sector working in India will have to step up to the challenge rapidly to make sure that they also get some of the pie from the infrastructure building phase, because once the business as usual state returns after the infrastructure is built, then the market is going to evolve very rapidly, and this entire phase of where the investments are currently going into the capabilities of building infrastructure will dwindle quite a bit. That's the first part. The second thing is, given the nature of the data itself from space, because the government is going to always be a big customer. So satellite data products, they have use in the private sector as well, but it is on the governments at both the central level and state level in various departments for whatever applications that they can find a use for, to adopt space sector data, the data that we can get from our space assets, from the companies which are working on analyzing these data and providing insights, to use as fruitfully as possible for their applications and for better governance itself. That is what will give it will generate the demand that is needed for the space industry in India to expand and reach that sort of sophistication and size that is there in other countries, say in US or in China or other places as well. We may or may not be launching a 10,000 satellite constellation like these countries in the near future. If we are looking at it, that's great. Then the companies working in space sector, the building the space infra, also get a huge fillip. But if that is not happening, then this is how the demand has to be sustained. The other thing that I would like to also add to this point is, if the demand is not in line with what the capability in India is available at the moment, what is available in India at the moment, the supply, then India should also focus on, all the private companies, the government organizations as well, should also focus on exports of both space services and data products, building, launching satellites from here, ground stations, and of course the satellite data products, the observations from the Earth observation, the insights that are gained from those. There are a number of countries in the world who have no aspirations for building that sort of space infra that some of the major powers in the world have. They don't have that infra, they don't have the funds to build that. They don't have the aspirations as well. They also do not have the capability to analyze and use that infra by themselves for their advantage. And all those markets are ripe for India to look for exports. And I think some good efforts have also been made in that direction. And people have analyzed, the government has analyzed also a lot of countries which we can certainly target for exports. I think so. In a nutshell, just to conclude my entire talk, the demand has to be generated domestically. Government will have to take the lead in procuring more and more from the space sector in terms of both hardware as well as software, services, data, everything. That cannot be denied. The second thing that we will have to look at is ramping up our capability to participate in the space infra building race that is happening and will be over in the next 10 years. And the third thing is that we will have to focus on exports, because domestic market demand may never be enough in India for the kind of capabilities that we have as well. We will have to look at exporting to the world as well. That's all from my side.
Thank you, Mr. Puri. To succinctly put the last point that Mr. Puri just mentioned, I know for sure that Mumbai Municipal Corporation, which has the largest revenue base right now in the country, it collects taxes orders of magnitude higher than many other municipal corporations in India. It still purchases images from Europe for its local uses, for its local applications. So the downward integration of use cases, the downward integration of customers into the country. When I say downward, I mean state governments, municipal corporations, bodies, local bodies within the government, as well as making sure that a lot of private sector, which is completely disparate from the space domain, they might be working in the agri space, they might be working in banking space, insurance space, they need to be cultivated even more. And that is why we are here talking about what next. The policy is in place. That policy needs to be fine-tuned even further so that many use cases are generated. But the use cases will be generated over a period of time. Things don't change overnight. And in such situations, Mr. Puri is extremely right that we need to hunt for markets in developing economies. We need to look at them in the developed markets, and so that our businesses have the necessary sustenance. They achieve the global competitiveness in which Invest India is ready to help. His views has been contrarian to the name of his agency. When he says Invest India, it has always been about bringing in those inward investments.
No, but we are also looking at trade now.
At trade now, yeah. So this is a welcome change. This is a big development that is happening. Something to watch out for. And I'll move on to Captain Vishal Kanwar. They've done an excellent study last year. I was privy to its initial iterations. He'll speak more about that.
Thank you, Chaitanya. I'll just speak on three areas. Of course, we are looking more from the future perspective, we are crystal gazing. But I just want to just touch upon the policy, Space Policy 2023, FDI policy, and what are the key takeaways. And then I will talk to you about some crystal gazing. This is the strategy work which we did for InSpace around areas where we need to focus, and especially on policy issues. So the first part, yes, the Space Policy 2023 was a very welcome policy. I think the four most important takeaways from that is, it has very clearly defined the roles and responsibilities between ISRO, InSpace, NSIL, and non-government entities. And I think that clarity never existed before. Kudos to that. The next best thing it has done is, it has created a new space ecosystem. And right now, it is just the foundation that it has laid. The challenge is, how does it get implemented? Any policy is very good on paper, but the challenge is, how do you put it into practice? So the new space ecosystem with this policy is envisaging towards is that the space agency becomes the enabler, the collaborator, and the facilitator of the entire space ecosystem. And that's the role for ISRO as defined in the policy. In other words, in simpler terms, essentially it is saying that any technology which ISRO creates, once it is operationalized and matured, for example, the small satellite launch vehicle technology, it needs to be transferred to the private ecosystem, so the private ecosystem can develop it and further build on it. And that's exactly what NASA did with SpaceX. SpaceX was nurtured by NASA, and today SpaceX is where it is. So it's the same, I would say, vision which this policy takes forward. The third thing which this policy does is, it also opens up infrastructure of ISRO for the private ecosystem. You have seen Agni-Cool being launched from SHAR, likewise, other rocket launching private companies. Even the test facilities which are there today in ISRO, they would also be available for use for testing and calibration for quality checks, and which is a huge thing, because those are very expensive facilities, and for any startup or MSMEs to go abroad for those facilities, it's a challenge. So I think these are some of the takeaways of this policy. As we speak, how much has been implemented? I don't think so. I think about 30 or 40%, but there's a long way to go. Unless we achieved about 80 to 100% implementation of the Space Policy 2023, we're not really in this new space ecosystem. And I think we're getting there, but we've got a long runway to take off. Now let me take you to crystal gazing. What is India looking at in the space economy? Today we are about $8.4 billion space economy as we speak, across the entire value chain of upstream, satellite manufacturing, launch vehicles, ground system, and also the downstream in EO navigation or communication. We aspire to capture a market of about $44.4 billion in the next 10 years, which is about till 2033. Now to capture that market, there are various goals which we have set for ourselves. And I encourage all of you to go to the InSpace website and go through this white paper. And I really compliment Department of Space and InSpace and ISRO for having created a white paper for an industry, for a sector, and putting it out in the open for everybody to see where is the sector going to focus. So there are some strategic goals mentioned, whether it is in satellite launch, satellite manufacturing, launch vehicles. There are goals in the ground segment. And I think the downstream area is an area which is completely neglected as far as India is concerned. Earth observation system, we are seeing a huge market of close to about $8 billion. We are not using satellite imagery other than defense in the country. How much is EO being used in agriculture, transport, infrastructure? And that's exactly what Bhaskar spoke about. There has to be a demand generation. And unless you generate demand, how will a private ecosystem thrive? And that demand generation, I mean, again, you go through the strategies, talks of pull and push factors, and typically the push factors are where the government has to step in. Each ministry has to see how they can help creating the ecosystem, and likewise, the 1.4 billion people in the country also have to be sensitized. The irony of the thing is that most of our villagers and tier 3 cities do have astrology and puja rooms. The challenge is, how do you shift it from the puja rooms to the other rooms in their houses? And that's demand generation. If we can sensitize a farmer, industrialist of using space to boost his economy. I want to give you some figures here. Globally, PwC has calculated the multiplier effect of investment in space just on the GDP is between 1.4 to 2.2. On employment, it is about 1.6 to 2.4. Those are the multiplier effects we are seeing. And every penny the government invests in this sector, within 5 to 10 years, you will see about 35% returns in terms of tax. So it's although a sunrise sector, but it's pretty attractive. It's out there on how do you craft your future policies and guidelines to create demand generation. Now, having crystal gazed in certain goals, what we look at it, then comes what capabilities you need to get there. And I would classify them under 4 buckets. First is creating of the platforms. Now, Bhaskar did speak about, we don't have an Earth observation platform in the country. We don't have something like Copernicus or Landsat in Europe and USA, respectively. What will it take to create a EO data aggregator platform in the country? And this Space Policy 2023 very clearly elucidates that any satellite imagery above a resolution of 5 meters, I think it's 5 meters, has to be given free of cost to each and every citizen in the country. And that's a huge ask. And obviously, to implement that, you need a EO data platform. And each one of us in the country should have free access to, satellite imagery of that kind of resolution. Of course, if it gets value added on top of it, you can be charged for that. So therefore, creating a platform for Earth observation, for navigation. I mean, if I tell you right now, the Navik constellation which ISRO has launched would give you far higher resolution than the GPS satellites in the country. It's most of us would be surprised. But the basic science behind is that GPS constellation was launched for temperate regions in Europe and US, whereas Navik constellation is specially designed for equatorial regions between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn for our country. So once Navik takes off, I see huge use cases and far more accurate navigation across whether it is transport, maritime, aviation, rail, or even for infrastructure, etc. And the third is also the communication side. Does the country need a LEO constellation? Maybe it does if it combines the requirements of both the strategic and the non-strategic sectors. But if you look at the requirements in a disparate way, in a secluded, separated way, then you don't have a business case. But if you do look at the requirement that what the military needs, and what ambassadors just spoke about, what happened in Ukraine, it's the satellite communication link provided by Starlink which has helped Ukraine fend off most of the attacks. So therefore, does the country need a LEO constellation for satellite? So these are some of the things which we have to look at as we go forward. And the next pillar, I would say, the ecosystem creation, right from R&D platforms. And I think the Space Policy 2023 is a step in that direction where you're sharing infrastructure. And the last point I would say is demand generation and enablers. And I think I just want to mention 2-3 points in the policy. What will it take for us to make satellites in the orbits be classified as infrastructure? Today, the infrastructure sector in the country has huge subsidies. I'm sure most of you who dealt with capital infrastructure. We see even a satellite in the orbit as an infrastructure. That satellite in the orbit, whether it is used for Earth observation, navigation, or communication, is facilitating use cases and value proposition for common people and creating socio-economic benefits. So likewise, subsidizing infrastructure, getting PLI here, getting tax rebates for R&D and investment in the private ecosystem, seeing the importance of this sector where you will get 2 times the GDP and more than 2 times the employment multipliers, I think is the need of the day. So these are some of my thoughts, of course. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Captain. That got me thinking. NHAI, which builds highways for us, they have infrastructure bonds. They have those highway masala bonds. Now that gets a lot of investors here in Delhi, in Mumbai, in big cities of India interested. Now we put in a lot of money there. You classify it as infrastructure, I think there is some precedence for investors to understand, okay, how this sector works, and there might be money coming in. There's dearth of, I spoke about this even in the last ISC last year. I'm speaking about it again. There is dearth of domestic institutional investors in the Indian space ecosystem right now. They are not yet investing. They are ready to invest. They are studying. They are doing all these surveys internally, but they're not taking the next necessary step. The time has come that we graduate from wherever we are right now and make those domestic institutional investors take the first punts, make those first investments. It could be low-hanging fruits, but they need to do that. I must also say that let's threaten them with foreign institutional investors. Let's tell them that there is competition coming, there is large amount of money coming in from outside. You need to ramp up, roll up your sleeves and start working on it. I'll go on to young colleague Pranav. Pranav has been writing fantastic literature in the think tank circuit on space policy. He has his thoughts to share on the geospatial policy as well as the SATCOM policy. Yeah.
Thank you, Chaitanya. Thank you, SIA-INDIA, for inviting me to speak here. When I was invited to speak here, I was immediately reminded of a paper that Ambassador Sood wrote in 2019, which was titled An Indian Space Law Long Overdue. 5 years since, we have made a great deal of progress, but one short of having a space law, which we can discuss more. So when the norms, guidelines, and procedures was released in May earlier this year, many Indian experts and experts abroad could rightly critiqued the policy, suggesting that the policy enabled the government to use its coercive arm to restrict space activities in India rather than enable space activities. So many of my friends and colleagues who are involved in thinking about a space policy began to ask ourselves this question. Did we create a new license Raj regime while hoping to have a liberalized space economy? After much introspection, the answer was no. We have not actually created a license Raj. In fact, we have created a policy that provides far more clarity on the regulatory landscape than what we had previously. To understand how we derived this answer, we must really trace the long tail of India's space policy evolution. I would go back to 1999 when the SATCOM policy was released, and 1 year later we had the SATCOM policy's norms. Now the policy had three main objectives. First, they wanted to lease the capacity on the Indian satellite system, INSAT. The second was to provide Indian entities a way to establish satellite systems in India. And finally, the third one was to allow Indian entities to access foreign satellite capacity via the Department of Space. Now, this policy was quite unique because it retained the powers of it retained the powers of the Department of Space and ISRO. The Secretary of the Department of Space, who also served as the chairperson of ISRO, was also chairing the same committee that decided on whom to provide license to. Therefore, the decision-making was quite opaque. Private entities did not know the specific timeline on when they would get licenses. And there was no reason why the government could simply not give you a license. They did not have to give you a written decision. And therefore, for almost 20 years, this policy was set in stone. Around 2015, companies finally began to realize that the global space ecosystem was changing, and therefore they started demanding, and they started asking some very basic questions. How do I test my rockets? How do I get licenses to how do I get a license to set up my own ground station? How do I make sure that ISRO is not my competitor? These are very basic questions, right? Especially when you compare it to the laissez-faire models of regulation in the United States, UK, and Australia. These are some very basic questions. And therefore, there was an intellectual exercise that began from 2016, where several people within this room were involved in, bringing the very first ideas about separating the regulator from the operator. And in 2019, Takshashila Institution, where I was working, also came up with a model space law along with others. And in 2020, we finally saw liberalization. It was a mammoth effort because it required both organizational mindset change. It requires ISRO to give up its powers, the powers that it had for almost 50 years. And it also required the government to embrace the fact that there are Indians who are not members of ISRO who could still do a great deal of work for India. And in that regard, the steps that we have taken to provide regulatory clarity, to give a fixed timeline on who can get authorization, how long will it take to get authorization, and what are the areas in which authorization is required. This is a level of transparency we've never had before. So to that end, it provides Indian entities, foreign entities, and investors the right details to make sure that their interests are safeguarded. There is a clear procedure that's outlined. So in that regard, the Indian space policy and norms, guidelines, and procedures fulfill the objective of ensuring that there is regulatory clarity. Of course, that does not mean that the policy is perfect. There are both structural issues with the policy as well as drafting errors. For example, India might be the first country that has written its obligations to basically a non-binding document, which is the Artemis Accords. And something has to be done to change that, because Artemis Accords is not a binding document. We don't have any obligations to the Artemis Accords. And the other smaller issues. So how do we solve these issues? I believe in essence it is throug¬ practice. Not every policy that the government brings out is never perfect. The TRAI guidelines that came out in the 1990s required several iterations through practice, because organizations learn, and it takes quite a long time for organizations to learn and shape themselves. So one way is for InSpace to provide more authorization, give clarity on thresholds. For example, when is there a business case? How do you establish a threshold for having a business case to set up a ground station outside India? This is only done through practice, right? You can't arbitrarily define a number for a business case. Eventually, I believe we will get to a stage where we will have several, asterisks on a policy, where there are several modifications that are made. But that will take at least a year or two. And of course, we need a space law, the space law that ultimately creates a framework where InSpace is truly an independent body, where it is not under the Department of Space, and there is an arbitration process similar to what we have at TRAI. And I believe that is possible, but it definitely requires a great deal of practice to realize that such a change is required. So I would consider the norms, rules, and procedures as the first public draft, and we will see many more iterations of this public draft in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you, Pranav. I come from academia, and people usually accuse academicians as those who sit on ivory towers. I'm ready to come down the ivory tower and ask you all, the learned audience. We are here not just to express our views as panelists, but we are here to gather your views, your opinions on pressing issues that are right now not troubling us or would trouble us, something of that sort. So before I go back again to my fellow panelists, I'd like to open up in between, with your permission, sir. If you have any, very strong opinions about SATCOM policy or the geospatial policy or the space policy in general, what is it that you want to happen next? Anybody? Raise your hands. The mic will come to you. First row. So please identify yourself.
Good morning, sir. Thank you for giving me an opportunity. I am Dr. S.K. Pandey, Secretary, Aeronautic Research and Development Board, DRDO. Sir, defense has got lot many applications. I will not go into that. I am coming to, because I am funding to the academia. Okay, this Aeronautic Research and Development Board is funding to academia and other research institutes in the country, in India. So my connect is with the academia only. Okay. So we are funding to the research related to aeronautics and aerospace, both, which is any problem which is relevant to DRDO or ISRO or maybe of any user like CSIR also, which uses this aeronautics or aerospace. We are funding to the research problems to academia and research institutes. Okay, this is one part. Coming on to the applications where business is more and more, I would like to highlight the requirement of civilians and civil aviation. And there is a huge requirement. This is a 140 crore country. And you will be surprised to know that there is a legacy here that people travel 48 hours in train. That too in air conditioned, luxury. In foreign countries, it is very costly. In India, it is almost 1 to 2 rupees a kilometer by train if you travel. One of the person working with DGCA, he told this one Indian Railways that if you are having excess of passenger in waiting list, please transfer. With the same amount, I will take them by air. I appreciate Captain Gopinath, who started Air Deccan, and my first flight was with my own money. It was from Patna to Delhi at the cost of 1,000 rupees. So that person showed the mirror to all the operators that a person can travel even in a lesser amount. And after that, so many players came and so many players went also. So there is a huge requirement of civil aviation, transport requirement in India. Huge requirement. If you go to the IRCTC site, try to book a ticket for tomorrow, you won't get. So there is a huge requirement. And next, I am coming to that SATCOM type of thing, where there is a communication requirement by the civilians also. I am starting a simple case of FM radio. The moment you go beyond a limit, go job. So you require such a communication, maybe in the music. Earlier there was a world set type of thing which has now gone off. So that sort of thing should come. Even now you are getting this technology of microwaves. Microwaves having tower problem. This tower is not catching here, that tower is not catching here, your mobile signal is going low, this and that. There are so many problems. So there are so much requirement of this space related SATCOMs, and maybe this airships and local satellites also, huge requirement in the country. So this one is that a policy should be made to address the larger people of India. And business is huge. We want every citizen of India wants the facility. And one thing should be used for each and everything. Just like one metro card, one master metro card can be used in bus, can be used in this one. This has taken almost 25 to 30 years. So my suggestion would be to address all the policies which can give benefit to the citizens of India. Thank you.
Okay. A comprehensive space policy is needed which addresses civil aviation concerns that you just spoke of. Anybody else? Alina? There.
Shall I go ahead?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the first set of responses that the panel has given on the particular topic. First of all, hi, I'm Alina Joseph. I represent the Netherlands Innovation Network hosted by the Consulate in Bangalore, and I look after the Indo-Dutch space partnerships here. I think for me it's rather a question to the panelists basically. So you have been talking about the different policies, right? And also last year, like recently we came up with a revised or the more nuanced policy where they are also talking about the FDI coming from abroad. So as someone who is working for a foreign mission here in India, how can we also attract these FDIs coming from abroad? Like what I know, talking to other colleagues or counterparts working in other foreign missions, is that most of the countries have different perspectives or priorities with India. And today morning, Dr. Goenka, he was also specifying that rather than a market, in other countries should also focus on being India's partner. But what is that way or the trajectory for the foreign countries to look into in that way? Especially starting from the FDI policies. Yeah.
See, again, if you just analyze the question further, why would a foreign company come to India? Right? So there are only two main reasons why they would come. The first is operational efficiency. The second is demand, and they're obligated then to do so, to come here. If there is enough demand from whoever is the customer, maybe government or private sector, let's say, if that happens as well in the future, then certainly there is incentive for a foreign company to set up its operations here and service that demand, given the right set of enablers and if there are no policy restrictions or roadblocks in place, which most of them have been removed, that's the good thing. The second one is operational efficiency. Now what that may take the form of is, first, there are cost efficiencies in India, right? So if there is a company who's looking at, say, downstream services or some kind of software which is working with satellite data, the cost of operations, the cost of software development in India, the arbitrage, the savings that you get from, say, Europe, USA, Japan, any other place, is well known. It is north of 45-50% is what you can get in India. If you are looking at product development, if you are looking at R&D, the cost of hiring a researcher in India is 1/5 of the global average. There are 200,000 plus engineers graduating in India, joining the workforce every year, more than that. So there is enough talent there, and there is enough cost-effective talent that is there. So that is one way that companies can look at, and that is certainly something that companies should look at as well. If they are not looking at it, they are missing the picture here. That's the first thing about operational efficiency. The second thing is, if you are looking to build and launch from India, the nature of space systems, space hardware is such that given that they are so sophisticated and fragile in many ways, despite them operating in extreme conditions, you want to minimize your supply chain as much as possible in terms of geographical scale, how much you spread it. So it is always advantageous for a company if they can have a satellite manufacturing unit very close to a launch facility. Now, given that launch facilities in India are coming up, Kulasekharapatinam has opened up recently, and the small satellite launch vehicle, the transfer of technology is happening, reusable vehicles are being developed in India, the trials are ongoing there. The cost of launching from India is going to come crashing down very quickly. Once that happens, there is always the incentive that, okay, if I want to launch from India because it is cost effective for me to do so, I'm saving a lot of money doing that, then why not set up my manufacturing also close to the launch station, which is originally the idea behind the setup of space parks also. The space parks that has been set up in Kerala, or the one that is coming up in Tamil Nadu. The idea is exactly that you want to have a manufacturing, a product development, a space engineering center right next to a launch station also. so that those synergies can come into play. So that is what we have to promote, and it's only a matter of time when these facilities are developed further and they start attracting the investments in India.
I'll rephrase what Bhaskar said. Do we need global capability centers for the space sector in India? Can we have them around Kulshekar Pattinam? Exactly.
So just want to add those, I was just covering that. You know, India is aspiring to be a global manufacturing hub for small satellites and for launch vehicles. So exactly what Bhaskar said, the space parks which are coming up. Now look at the defense side. There is Tamil Nadu Defense Corridor, UP Defense Corridor coming up. Now, what are these defense corridors? And likewise, it's happening in the space sector. There are fiscal and non-fiscal incentives the state governments and central governments doing. If C-295 aircraft manufacturing is happening in Gujarat, because Gujarat government has given a lot of fiscal and non-fiscal incentives. So, foreign OEMs, companies, in addition to the demand and operational efficiency which Bhaskar very comprehensively covered, they are also looking at what incentives are there for setting up in terms of subsidies, fiscal, non-fiscal, and a lot of state governments are vying to attract for him. That is one. And of course, the FDI policy allows 74% under automatic route for satellite manufacturing, 49% for launch vehicles, you know, and about 100% on the downstream. So if you look at the policy, it is and component, subcomponent. We are telling the world that please come and invest in India, mostly in the ground segment, in the downstream, which is EO, navigation and communication. And that's where, I mean, what we see the market potential in the next 10 years is the maximum. We have $32 billion market potential in the downstream, out of the $44 billion. So that is where it is attractive. So I think if we pitch to them that this is an area you can come up and set up a wholly owned subsidiary in India, create, and the last part I want to mention is that not only for the demand in India, they could also look at for demand, global demand, make in India for the world. And after China 2.0, people are looking at India as an alternate supply chain, weaving into their global. Just like an Apache helicopter today, fuselage is made by a JV between Tata and Boeing, and it goes back to Seattle and gets weaved into the Apache manufacturing chain and sold to various countries. So likewise in space sector, how can we weave into a global supply chain? So all of these are the factors which are probably attracting the foreign OEMs. I think we are at that inflection point. They'll start coming in as we go forward here.
Thank you. We'll speed it up from here. Yeah, ma'am.
I'll be quick. Victoria Sampson. I'm with the Secure World Foundation. We're a U.S.-based nonprofit that focuses on space sustainability. I wanted to congratulate India on the national space policy. I know that was a long time in coming, and I think the division of labor and responsibilities that came out in regards to in space, and so I think it's fantastic. However, I will point out there's one thing that's missing from the Indian national space policy, and that's any discussion of military space priorities or activities. I know that some countries do include those priorities in their national space policy, so I'm curious to know if any of the panelists know, are there plans for an India space policy 2.0 that includes that, or some sort of Indian national security space strategy, or something along those lines? Thank you very much.
Well, ISRO right from the beginning has always prided itself on being essentially a civilian organization. And I think that is what is reflected in the Space Policy 2023. However, as I referred to, the Ministry of Defense is acutely conscious of its own specific requirements. And that is why the Ministry of Defense has set up, they set up first within the Integrated Defense Staff, they set up a unit dealing with space issues. It then graduated to a Defense Space Agency, and now that is part of, now that there is this theaterization and the Department of Military Affairs that has been set up in the Ministry of Defense, they will be setting out their own requirements. They are already, I mentioned to you about IDEX, which is an initiative of the Ministry of Defense to engage more closely with the small and medium scale enterprises and the startups. Startups, as you know, have a very different kind of a funding requirement, and they can develop dedicated solutions to specific problems, which is exactly what the Ministry of Defense is looking for. We are also working with some of our partners. The key one that is there, for which the US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was just here about 10 days or 2 weeks ago, is the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, which has space as one of the items identified for cooperation. Now, in that also, we are looking at, there is an initiative known as India-US X, which is startup oriented, where you co-develop and co-produce solutions. So that's that is why you don't find that much mention of the defense applications or the defense utility. But I can tell you that people are extremely, extremely conscious of it within the government, in the Ministry of Defense.
Quickly. It was his turn. Be quick, be quick. Yes.
Okay, hello. So my question is that how can we decentralize the space like in a more sped up way? Because as we can see that decentralization of space is very important to compete with any company. Like these days in India also, we are seeing decentralization happening. But if we compare these to other countries like China, and we are comparing obviously because we are the next country which is coming up. So if we want to compare or compete with any of those countries which are so ahead in technology, the only thing that can compete is the privatization of those things. Because when we see private organizations entering into these domains, they really boost up these things because of obviously they are spending more money on those things. So how can in our country we bring those things to like it is there but it's very less. So how can we speed up that thing so that more and more people are doing that?
Pass it.
Yeah, my question is with respect to, I'm Sanjay Singh from Solar Industries India Limited. We are manufacturers of explosives and propulsion system. And like Captain Kanwar said that basically it's a high investment and industry which requires upfront investment, and all the panelists in the morning also talked about it. So what sort of are we what sort of work is happening toward declaring this high investment requirement into infrastructure? And as a model policy, because if you look state to state, they have different, do they call it defense sector or they call it aerospace sector, but there is no coherent policy with respect to giving the incentive so that upfront investment can happen, industries can come out and invest it. So from the Invest India perspective or from the model concept of incentive as an infrastructure industry, is there any plan? There should be a plan with respect to how to encourage for this high risk, high investment, long gestation period investment, particularly in the field of energetics, explosives and propulsion system for the space. Thank you.
Okay. So last 30 seconds each for all the speakers, starting with Bhaskar.
Regarding this question? See, so regarding your question, it always makes sense to have some kind of a co-development program where there's a long-term development vision here for a requirement that the government may have, where it is working closely with the industry, and that is what a number of programs that are being taken up by the Ministry of Defense are also along similar lines. Ministry is also funding a number of companies for these programs. So I think that exactly that the entire mechanism is to exactly address this problem of risk in upfront investments that are required for these sort of projects. So the mechanisms are there, and I'm certain that they will expand further in the future. Captain Kanwar?
So I'll take on the same question, that slightly different perspective. What you mentioned about code development is exactly the Space Policy 2023 say. Like I said, it is asking the space agency, which is ISRO, to be, which it is donning that mantle of being a facilitator, enabler, and the customer of the private ecosystem. So these are the three major roles which the Space Policy 2023 is impinging upon. And that's happening. And that's the reason ISRO is sharing the technology of small satellite launch vehicle with the private ecosystem. It is looking at LBM Mark III in a public-private partnership model with HAL and L&T. So steps are being taken in that direction for co-development, co-production. And obviously, the challenge is how meticulously we implement this policy, and also the space strategy which has been created by InSpace. How do we meticulously implement it? To the second point which you mentioned, sir, regarding access to capital or funding for aerospace, defense and space sector is always a challenge. But what if I tell you today, I was in a conference recently and I spoke about these sectors, that within the fund managers in the country, I don't know how many of you know, HDFC Defense Fund is today oversubscribed. Today, there are about $22 billion of investment in aerospace and defense funds, mutual funds in the country. That's the level of investment the stock is looking at. There is something known as a DFI, Defense Fund Index, which has been created in the National Stock Exchange. Stocks of Cochin Shipyard Limited and BL are. So the point I'm making is that there is funding happening in the country. And if you see globally, the fund managers always precede funding, and then the private equity and the venture capitalists come in. And we will see private equity and venture capitalists coming. I completely agree with you. We have not seen a huge investment taking from private equity to the tune of, say, $30 or $40 million to a startup or MSME in aerospace, defense and space sector. It will happen, because the fact is, if fund managers are ready to put in about $22 billion, and it is all of our money which we are investing in mutual funds and defense funds, what prevents from a private equity or venture capitalists to come in? So I think it will happen. We'll have to wait and watch, and we have to be at it, because this is what the global trend has been. Lastly, I would say, both the space policy and the strategy document which has been created, like I said, this is the only sector we have seen which has a white paper for the next 10 years. And kudos to InSpace and Department of Space for that. And once, even the Ministry of Defense doesn't have a white paper for aerospace defense right now. Space sector has, which is amazing. So all of us know what should you focus on the next 10 years. The challenge is how do we implement each one of those action items? And that's, I think, what is, and once they are implemented, we would see a change happening.
I have a point on competing with China. Usually when we think about competition with China, we don't necessarily have to compete one-on-one with Chinese satellites. One of the advantages that India has, it's a vibrant democracy with a wide range of strategic partnerships. Having those strategic partnerships in space integrates you to a worldwide network, which creates a resilient architectures in space. You become less vulnerable when you partner with more capable partners, and you also our geographic requirements are quite different. So we must ensure that do we have the satellite capabilities to fulfill the desires of our people, and not necessarily competing with China. So competition with China is not necessarily symmetric. As a country, definitely, because the Chinese commercialization model is quite different, it's quite murky, which blurs the line between what is a government-owned company, what is a state-owned company, and what is a completely private company. So therefore, we must look at models that are quite different, that are based on organic partnerships, that are based on a long-term relationship building with our allies. And that's how I would look at in competing with China, rather than pure one-to-one satellite building or rocket building competition. Thank you.
Okay. Last word for the chair.
Thank you. I think I agree with Captain Kanwar that the white paper is a good thing. Now, what is important is that the 10-year vision that has been laid out be broken down into specifics on all aspects, which includes which is basically what we've been talking about in terms of building an ecosystem that will also look at demand, that will look at the manufacturing, that will look at the startup sector, that will look at the funding requirements and where the funding is going to come from, and so on. We will also look at exports. So I think we need to break it down. Instead of having a 10-year, I mean, you know, when we don't plan for the whole week, we plan from meal to meal, as it were, that after breakfast, the next is lunch, and then it is dinner. So the same way, I think we need to stagger it down, perhaps to first to 5 years, then to every year, and then to every half year, and perhaps that is the best way forward.
Thank you so much. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, the chair, moderator, and all the speakers for that extensive chat. With this, we come to the end of the first session, and we move ahead with the felicitation. I request the chair to kindly felicitate. We'll start with the moderator, Dr. Chaitanya Giri, Associate Professor from Puri University. Captain Vishal Kanwar, MD PWC. Mr. Bhaskar Puri, AVP Aerospace and Defence Space in West India. And Mr. Pranav R. Satyanath, Independent Researcher and Policy Analyst. May I request Lieutenant General Pannu, the advisor SIA, to kindly felicitate our chair, the chair of the session, Ambassador Rakesh Sood ji.
Yes, sir.
We can have a group picture as well.
Sir, please take a group picture.
Thank you very much, the chair, moderator, and all the speakers for the first session.